Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Kings in Queen City podcast. It's your host, Taylor Pugh, with my co-host,
Ed Pugh.
It's great to have my co-host actually back in the country. He was recently traveling in the DR, so he's a little tanner than normal today, which for us being redheaded males, it's kind of difficult for us to do.
Being fair-skinned guys like we are, getting the right amount of sun can be a little bit of a challenge. But yeah, thankfully, we were just able to travel to the Dominican Republic and spend a couple days there in the sun, the surf, and the sand. It was just really great to be able to step away from the business for a little bit, physically and mentally recharge. And one of the things that's most exciting is that the experience in the Dominican Republic was largely paid for by cash flows that were generated both within our business and from our tenants, and that the lifestyle that we're creating will allow us opportunities to do a lot more trips like this in the future.
Ed, I'm really excited about my trip to Australia I have planned at the beginning of next year. As part of that, we're going to get to visit with some of our students, and so I'm excited about that opportunity. But again, that's paid for with money from our tenants and from our businesses, so we're not coming out of pocket any personal money on those type of events. What we're really looking for is other people that can join us in doing the same thing.
Taylor, it's that whole trade-off of it's not a limited, scarce number of people who can live the lifestyle that we choose to live. All of us collectively can live the same type of lifestyle. And so when we accept that there's abundance in our life, we can do a lot of things.
Ed, I'm really excited about your travels. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so again, we got to travel to the Dominican Republic, experience a lot of the culture, both on a resort there and off a resort there. And one of the ways that my wife and I really like to travel is to get off of the true resorts and go in to where the locals go, where they eat, where they hang out, where they play. And being able to do that gives us a feel for what kind of the real country experience is like. So we definitely got to do that. The Dominican Republic, just like a lot of places, can be a great example of how income inequality and kind of some distances in lifestyles are pretty obvious. You know, Taylor, you have communities there that they don't have their own plumbing in their homes, and they use shared water and bathrooms for whole communities, and that's pretty surprising. Then you have these beautiful homes that sit on the cliff overlooking the ocean, that are just really, really gorgeous places and have all the luxuries of kind of first world living. So traveling often gives us an opportunity to step back and look at ourselves and see what points of view we have in life, and gives us an opportunity to kind of examine those a little bit.
Ed, you're absolutely right. In my travels, I've seen that in a number of places where you have the excess and the want, we'll call it. A lot of people have opinions about other places that are based on mass media. And I like to explain it in this term. If you were to judge the United States based only on MTV and Better Home and Garden, you might have a specific opinion about the United States that might not be factual.
Those are great examples, Taylor, is either of those independently, they have very specific images that they're trying to portray. And we know that actually the U.S., as an example, that the U.S. is neither MTV or Better Homes and Gardens, that those are vignettes that exist within a broader spectrum of experiences that happen in the United States. Taylor, back to traveling in the DR, one of the things that stood out to me, or was reminded to me while I was traveling and taking some downtime and kind of just contemplating on some things, is this concept of it's never always.
And Ed, for everyone listening on our podcast today, what do you mean?
Here's an example. We believe that the sun will come up tomorrow because it's always come up every day before. But scientifically, we understand that stars cease to exist on some timeline. And so if you step back far enough, there's a time scale where, for example, the sun will no longer rise, right?
Well, and there was a day that it didn't rise yet,
scientifically speaking. And so the idea that it's always something or that it's never something portrays an idea or a mindset that's pretty well fixed within a specific box. And so that box, in the case of the sun example, is the sun will always rise. However, on a large enough scale, again, that's not factually true. There are other examples of this. Taylor, while I was on my trip, I had an individual come up to me, a local Dominican. He came up to me and said, if I fly from, I was in a city called Puerto Plata. If I fly from Puerto Plata to Alaska, will I be flying into Canada or the United States? For most of the people listening to our podcast, they're very familiar with the fact that Alaska happens to be a state of the United States, and in fact would look at this individual and say, that's a dumb question. That's a really dumb question. The problem with it, guys, is that it's not a contextual question that matters to him. It's not a contextual question that matters to him. And so it's not as if it's a dumb question. It's just his life experience hasn't caused that to be a necessary piece of information that he's retained.
To put that in perspective, I challenge anyone on the podcast to name 3 of the 31 provinces in the Dominican Republic, just for a contextual understanding of his basic question was the reverse of that, where they have 31, we have 50. For context, it would make the most amount of sense. If you're in the audience, could you name some of the provinces in the Dominican Republic?
And why not, right? And why not? That's the important part that I was trying to get to today with our concept of it's never always. Just because we have a specific view and a specific set of biases that have us understanding the way that we interact doesn't mean that all people have quote unquote common knowledge on this exact point. I think we serve people best when we have the opportunities to try and remove our biases or assumptions about their experiences and their needs and just simply ask really good questions. And this was really illustrated to me in that interaction.
Ed, that is a really interesting interaction. And to be able to have the maturity level to step back and say, where is this question coming from? I'm sure you guys had a great conversation about it. I'm sure you described it well and you went in depth on, it's really part of a state, but it is up there on the other side of Canada, like on and on. It's interesting to have the awareness to have that conversation versus not being culturally aware of what's happening and then having the ignorant response of course it's a state because I know that.
Right, and that I'm superior for some reason, or I'm so much better because I have this specific understanding. And that brings me back to the observation of it just wasn't a contextual thing that he understood. Now, in the Dominican Republic, there are things that work different. For example, motorbikes act as taxis for a lot of places.
You mean like a motorcycle? I can hail a motorcycle and then ride on the back of somebody's motorcycle as a taxi?
Yes. And in fact, we saw, just a simple aside, we saw a family of 4 on a motorcycle with a driver. 4 people and a driver. So a total of 5 people were on one motorbike.
On a normal motorcycle that we imagine in the United States.
Yeah, like just Taylor's ridden a little bit. So just think of like a standard Kawasaki kind of dirt bike looking bike.
My mind is blown right now. Contextually, because that's not the norm for me. So contextually speaking, this is not the norm. So I'm really intrigued about this concept.
But you're surprised where for the local Dominican, this is common. And so these are the things that are surprising. So my only point to say is that I think as we seek to overcome any of our biases, and instead of saying, hey, that's a really dumb point of view, or that's a ridiculous point of view, why does that person have that point of view is a better question. And could I serve them better if I helped educate them on a different point of view? Taylor, so a good example of that comes to my mind is on my Saturday morning call that I host for the Kingdom Real Estate. The last call, a very young guy who's in the Charlotte market, he's just dominating. He's taken a lot of action. He said, I sat down with a family whose grandfather had just passed. Initially, the family didn't want to talk about any of the financial situations that he was in. However, he was able to remove some of the biases and negative experiences that the family was having by just asking them some simple questions. And then he said something very powerful. He said, could I share with you a little bit of my understanding about some options that your family has at this moment?
I know that individual, Ed, and the way that that would have come off, especially from him, would have been so incredibly sincere that you didn't have a choice but to say yes. There wasn't an option. With the sincerity that he would have came off on that conversation, you had to say yes.
Absolutely. And so, it's all about educating people and understanding why they have the point of view that they have, or trying to understand, maybe a better term there, trying to understand why they have that specific point of view, and then educating them away from that point of view into a space of better information that allows you to serve them more completely.
Ed, do you have another example of something like that?
Yeah, Taylor. So this one you and I talked about already, but for the listeners, so I was talking to a young Dominican there, as I often like to do when I travel, and asking him very specific questions about, what's his cost of living and how much does he make and things like that. And, relatively speaking, they make very little money in the Dominican Republic. Now, cost of living is a little lower, but the standard of living for the average Dominican is probably lower than the United States, just generally speaking.
Well, Ed, as you've shared, many of them don't have running water and many of them don't have restrooms inside their homes. This thought of I'm poor in the United States is a little biased because you haven't traveled enough to understand how rich you actually are.
Yeah, Taylor. And so for sure, in a future podcast, we can share a little bit more about our perceptions about poverty in the U.S. from the view that you and I have, having traveled a little bit more. So I was talking to this young man about where he was and what he was doing. And he said to me, he said, I'm really interested in buying a piece of property and then renting it out for visitors to come. And I jump at the opportunity to encourage that. And I shared with him details about the website Airbnb, which he had never heard of before. And how if he's going to be targeting specifically Canadian and American travelers, that can be a very valuable tool, and also that Europeans use it as well. Then we talked a little more. And of course, Taylor, then where do I go? I want to tell them about our brand, right? So, hey, let me tell you about the Kings and Queens City and what we're doing. And then in that conversation, as I'm talking with him, and his English was a little weak and my Spanish is almost non-existent. We had to be in English. You know, Taylor, as I'm talking to him and I tell him, yeah, Taylor and I, we do this podcast. His literal response to me was, what's a podcast?
Ed, it's amazing to me how different life is in different regions of the world. We take in media and information, and we take for granted that Uber, and in our market, we now have Uber Eats, so it'll deliver food from any restaurant, and I can go to Airbnb and, all of these technology solutions that might not be available in other markets or other regions of the world, and we just take it entirely for granted. I'm willing to bet something like 80% of the US or more would be able to tell you what a podcast was if you were to ask them in a survey. But this young man in a different country, in a different cultural context, that was not the norm that every American would understand. And that he has a different set of inputs. As we like to point out regularly, your inputs are what feed your output. So his knowledge base was based on the inputs he received. And in his input, Airbnb didn't exist. In his input, podcast didn't exist. That's not to say they don't. In his version of the world, though, they didn't.
It was a neat opportunity to talk with him about that. And in fact, Taylor, I think he and I are now Facebook friends. And so it would be fun to watch him develop this into a real business where he's able to host, folks coming to the Dominican Republic and able to provide with some housing solution that provides people a great place to stay, but then also him and his family with a little higher level of comfort for some years to come.
Ed, what's really great about that experience specifically was that as we do, you took the opportunity to speak to every person you can about what we do, and you exercised our lighthouse mentality by continuing to grow faith and power in other people. And so I really love that. A similar experience for me happened recently. My massage therapist, she's a single mother, and we were talking about the fact that she was looking to buy a home for her and her family. In talking about that, she was talking about how she was going to be saving up a down payment for some next couple of years so that eventually she could buy a house. I know my audience here is groaning as I say this, but I then talked to her about the creative strategies that we use to buy real estate and explained to her that there were other options available. In this specific case, I recommended NACA, NACA.com, because they give something called a character-based loan. And that's going to allow her to get a loan where she wouldn't normally qualify under what we call conventional lending standards.
Yeah, Taylor, and what's neat about that is you were able to share with her something that didn't exist as a possibility before you shared it with her. And so how much better have you positioned her to solve the challenge of, hey, I would like to find a house for me and my family to live in?
Ed, you're absolutely right. Another fun mindset thought for her, she's taking her 12-year-old daughter down to Disney World for the weekend. And so as I was talking to her about how I would finance that and how I would have my 12-year-old assist me in paying for the trip, she says, you know what? That's a really good idea. She runs a t-shirt business, her daughter. So we've talked about how for her next birthday, they're going to Belize, and how the daughter's going to help pay for her own trip by starting a business. So not only have I encouraged her to become a homeowner and have that huge pride of ownership that comes with it, I've also encouraged her family to take changes, she's now recommended Naka to other family members. And so by me taking the opportunity, as you did, to speak to one individual, I've been able to spread my message to, at this point, help 10 people. And I hope that that balloons into hundreds of people, which will assist me to get to my goal of financially freeing 1 million people using a multi-level mentoring program. Because as I offer her support, she offers support to her circle of influence.
Taylor, that's really neat to watch the way that sharing information with someone and the opportunities give them tools to solve more problems. It's really, really neat.
An interesting side note to that was that as she shared with her friend how it works and that they both signed up with the workshops, her friend, who I don't know, was shocked that I had given away this information free of charge, that I hadn't charged her something on the back end, or there wasn't a go to the back of the room and sign up with a credit card, like that we just continue to be the lighthouse we are in our life and that it was okay.
And again, bringing that full circle, the part I would share is to say, remember, it's never always that those types of statements, the absolutes that those are often generalizations that are wrong and display a mindset that's often stuck thinking in a specific box. And so as we seek to solve problems for people, the better we can do to remove our own biases and assumptions, the better we are able to serve them and their families at their times of need.
Ed, you're absolutely right. I think a lot of people have these cultural biases that were individually caused by the environment they were brought up in. Some people think that a color means a specific affiliation. Some people think that by driving a certain type of car or speaking a certain way, that it implies a certain education level. Fortunately, in our experience, we found this not to be true. One of our really good friends, he shared it publicly, so I'm not afraid to share it, is a 2-time convicted felon that has changed his life because the inputs that he received previously weren't leading him in the direction he wanted to go.
And what's neat about that specific individual, Taylor, is now not only is he changing his life, but he's leading others to do the same.
As we encourage one person's light to shine, the glow that it puts out attracts other people. And so one by one, we're growing in intensity, the amount of people that we are affecting change in the world on, by simply being the light that we're allowed to be.
By the way, if you guys aren't in the REI Masters Facebook group and you'd like to learn more about individuals who are doing that, definitely check that Facebook group out.
Ed, thanks. Guys, if you want to connect again, that's REI Masters on Facebook. Go ahead and check it out there. With that, we're going to wrap up. Again, appreciate you being here. Appreciate you being subscribed. If you haven't subscribed to us on YouTube yet, I'd specifically ask you to do that. We're also available on Instagram and Facebook as The Kings in Queen City. Remember to check your cultural biases and figure out how to just solve the problem as we teach.
Guys, and with that, we invite you to go out there and keep solving problems. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you soon.